Great. Well, welcome to this presentation on a networked ecosystem perspective. I'm Jasper Voorendonk. I have a background in philosophy and specifically in network thinking. And in the next 15 minutes, I want to take you along this journey of understanding a little bit of this network perspective. I want to share two universal network principles and how they can help with overcoming some ILP adoption challenges, and how our open source project AgnostiPay fits in. So, let me begin with taking you to nature. Who here likes to be in nature? Wow, that's great. Almost everyone. That's great to see. And it's also, when I'm back home, I love to go take walks in the forest close to my home. And when I'm there, I'm always amazed by this sort of interconnectedness of the fungi, the plants, the trees, and also the animals that are in this sort of ecosystem and have this very interesting feedback loop systems within that. Is this also something that maybe you pondered upon when you were walking through the nature close to your place? I see some nodding heads, so that's a good thing. Yeah, so I think that by understanding these sort of complex intertwined connections between all sort of different network layers, of which you could say an ecosystem consists of, that we can begin to understand how these ecosystems or networks form resilient structures of how to deal with input from the outside. That they can create the adoption of new organisms using the network layers which are inside of these ecosystems. And also how these ecosystems can change by both new organisms that are in the networks, but also how it relates to the things outside of the ecosystem. And of course, if you don't believe me, we're now here in beautiful Costa Rica, so I would definitely invite all of you then to go outside and see that for yourself. But that's after the talk. First off, I want to take you along this sort of idea that to think of Interledger as a part of an ecosystem for the next 10 minutes. Because you could say that Interledger itself is also something that was, let's say, born, built, and will be nourished within an ecosystem. It's not something that is developed or created outside of it. It is inherently something that is created within an ecosystem. So if we sort of take that as a starting point, we can take out two universal network principles. We can, of course, take a lot more of those principles, but we have too little time, so therefore I'm only taking two. And one of them is on the relationship level, which is about creating symbiotic relationships through open interfaces. And the other one is on the network level, so the more abstract level. And that is about how these networks can change by the changing of transaction flows that goes through these networks. So we start with the first, this is on the relationship level, and I want to, because we're here, of course, at the Interledger Summit, which is very much focused on tech, I want to use a metaphor from the tech world, and that is the metaphor of the internet and the browser. And in this example, you could also say there is a sort of network layer below, right, the internet, and then there's a browser which forms this, you could say, open interface to connect to the network. We can, of course, think of the internet like sort of separately, as if it exists separately outside of everything else. But we see that the growth of the internet came because there was a open interface to be able to connect to the internet, right? So that an end user could be able to put resources in the internet and get resources out of the internet. And this helped to create this adoption of the internet all across the globe, let's say. And it is an important thing that, of course, the browser is this open interface well, let's say in a non-closed way. So if we think about this, then of course the question we could raise is, if we think about Interledger, what are potentially some things that could help with creating the Interledger adoption? Does someone have some idea of creative points that could be pushed out? Via utility. think that's also a very good one, yeah. And a utility then for who? Does someone has an idea? Well, maybe, of course, yeah? Nice. That's a very interesting idea. That's cool. Hopefully, well, I think, yeah. Sadly, we didn't have a mic, but I think that's a very beautiful idea, and I think that also involves this point of providing value for the end user, right? And to create that sort of connection. So here I want to, by example, take another example from nature and take the network layer of the interaction between rhizomes and trees. And we could see here that the underlying network is this sort of rhizome layer, the layer where all the fungi are, and provide this sort of wood wide web, in a sense. And that on top of that, we have the trees, which are, you could say, sort of the end users, which form this symbiotic relationship to the network, right? So the tree gets resources out of the sun, which is on a different network layer. It puts the resources in the network layer, and it gets resources out of that to both help it grow itself and to grow the underlying network. So just in the same way, we can think about that sort of network layer and the end user. And then, of course, the interesting thing to point out here is that that all these separate trees or end users are connecting through the underlying wood wide web to a sort of open interface. That every specific, like let's say, plant and tree has their own forms of specific fungi, which create these integrations to the trees and to the underlying mycelium network. And I think, therefore, it's also very important that we make sure, if we think about this in a sort of Interledger context, as Interledger is this underlying network, that we make sure that these connection between the end user and the network is as open and as transparent as possible, so that we don't put, let's say, a closed source middleman in between that will stifle the potential interaction that an end user can have with the network. So make sure that we do sort of symbiotic relationships, no middleman, and open interfaces to help that adoption. And this is also where our open source project AgnostiPay comes in. We provide these sort of connections for the end user as an open interface to the services and the banks that they already have. And this helps them to more easily connect with the underlying network and steer resources and value that they have from a different place towards the Interledger network. And of course we do that through sort of personal end user credentials or API keys, but that is very more the technical part. I want to keep it a bit on the philosophical, metaphorical level. But that is the first part, and this is towards this relation on the relationship level. And now we want to bring it to the more abstract network level. And I want to share yet again a sort of metaphor from nature of how these networks work or how they can change, let's say. And here we have a very simple example of a mycelium or a fungi, which can go through sort of three different stages. The first one is a sort of spore state when there are separate, let's say, lines. They can grow together into a sort of fungi clouds. And what they do then is by continuously, let's say, folding the outside in, creating relations and breaking relationship within the networks, and that they can connect with other existing networks already out there to be able to grow faster and get more, let's say, energy and resources in the network. And then a very interesting thing can happen, that in a flashpoint the network, poof, creates something completely different, and that is a mushroom. While it is still the same network, it goes to a completely different diagram or shape, let's say. So if we use this metaphor, and of course we have to know that this is a very simple example. This is a mushroom with only 3 stages. We know of mushroom sorts also around here, which can do like 27 stages of different forms and stuff. And of course, if we think about our reality, then the complexity becomes, of course, much bigger. But we can use that a little bit as a metaphor to think about Interledger and how Interledger can change from the state where it is maybe is now, right? We have like spores through all the grant programs and people working all around the globe to do stuff locally in, I think, a very beautiful way. But then the question is like, how can we move towards this sort of cloud state to make sure that we are not putting just, let's say, mushrooms in the cloud, in the ground, but understand that we have to go through these sort of stages in that sense. And then the question is, of course, like how can Interledger change from the state where it is in now towards this sort of networked ecosystems? And that is by connecting to already existing networks out there. And these existing networks can be, for example, something of like the old traditional banking networks. It could be, for example, in AI. It could be local networks of transportation, of the transportation industry, or whatever you think of, can think of in your local context of networks that have these high transaction volumes going through them, and that you are looking for forms to create connections towards these networks, because that can then help to potentially, let's say, create a mushroom and change the ecosystem and the forms and the behaviors of the underlying network. And well, this is also yet again where our AgnostiPay project comes in, that by creating these connections to the traditional banking network, where you have the also forms of transaction volumes already there, that can help with creating the adoption of the Interledger network in that sense. So, well, that was the main point. I hope you have a little bit of insight into sort of the network perspective, that you can maybe think of this two sort of takeaways. One is on the relationship level, and that is thinking about always sort of symbiotic relationships towards the end user, the thing that uses the network. And that you try to do this as open, transparent, and direct as possible. And on the network level, try to find existing networks that are already like around you in a way, and trying to find connections towards that, because that can help to change the shape and the forms and the behaviors of the network. So I would say, like, hey, let's focus on connecting to this existing network and not focusing on, let's say, planting mushrooms, because then we're can have a great chance to create this underlying adoption of that. So, thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to ask them now. If you have to, let's say, percolate it a little bit, you can, of course, come to me later. Or send an email to connect@AgnostiPay. We're more than, looking forward to talk about your questions. So thank you very much.